16 years ago, Edwin was sitting in a car on the side of the road. Edwin was an alcoholic. He'd been drinking, and now he was smoking weed with a friend. As they sat there just hanging out, a cop walked up. He saw the window was open. He decided to see what was going on. So he walked up and leaned on that open window. Edwin panicked. He floored it. The cop had to grab onto the window to keep from getting run over. And somehow that cop managed to hang on until Edwin had finally stopped. Edwin was charged, and he was charged by a prosecutor like me. The law was clear for what he was facing. He was facing felony assault on a police officer. He was looking at DUI, resisting arrest, reckless endangerment, possession of drugs, possession of drug paraphernalia. Overall, Edwin was looking at 10 to 12 years in prison. And this is where most people say all the prosecutor wants to do is step in and get that max. But not Edwin's prosecutor. Edwin's prosecutor recognized that the real issue here was addiction. So instead of sending Edwin to prison for 10 years, he set up a plan for treatment. And he set up a plan to hold Edwin accountable for following through with that treatment. And because he did that, as of September 21st, Edwin's been sober for 16 years. Edwin even went back and worked in that court where he was once a defendant as a mentor for other people that needed that second chance. And now I tell this story first because it's a great example of what prosecutors can do when they focus on the person instead of just the crime. It's something that's still too rare across the country today. But I also tell this story because Edwin is my uncle. And his story, his experience convinced me that the problem with our criminal justice system is that we are too focused on equality. Now I get it, that's a weird thing to say. Who comes to a TEDx event and says that we need less equality? Equality is fundamental to who we are as Americans. It's fundamental to who we are as people. And nowhere is that more true than the criminal justice system. In the criminal justice system, we have the saying, justice is blind. And it's the idea that no matter who someone is, race, gender, wealth, religion, no matter who someone is, when they get into the courtroom, they will be treated the same. And that's a powerful idea, but the reality is that society is not blind. So when we make decisions in the criminal justice system, those end up having ripple effects throughout society. And we get to decide in the criminal justice system if we want to amplify the status quo of how society already is, or if we want to try to change it. Rather than equality, to truly pursue justice, we need to pursue equity. But what does that actually mean? What's the difference between equity and equality? It's not just a lawyer's semantics. Equality is the idea that we treat people the same. Equity is the idea that we treat people differently. So at your office, when someone's buying donuts on Friday, equality says that everyone chips in the same amount. Equity says that the CEO is going to pay, because she's the one that has the status and the money. It's straightforward when you put it like that, right? So in criminal justice, it's a little more complicated, but equality says that we look just at the facts of the crime and we make sentences based on those facts. Equity says that we look at the facts of the crime, but we also look at the individual defendant and victim and community in that case. And equality is premised on the idea that good comes from consistency, while equity is premised on the idea that good comes from making that defendant and victim and community better off at the end of the process than they were at the beginning. This is something that isn't just true in criminal justice or in donuts. This is something that every parent has had to deal with. I still remember being a kid, sitting in the back of the minivan, whining to no end about how my brother got something that I hadn't gotten, and how unfair that was. And I remember my mom saying, fair doesn't mean equal. Yet somehow, I forgot my mom's wisdom when I was a couple months onto the job as a prosecutor. I know she's probably mortified to hear I'm not always thinking about her wisdom. So I had two cases that were pretty much the same on their face. They were both DUIs. Both guys, Carlos and Jeremy, had gotten pulled over. They were weaving. They failed their field test. They blew a .12 on the breathalyzer, 50% over the legal limit. So it was pretty obvious that they were guilty. There was no question about that. But these are two very different people. Jeremy works at a tech company. He makes well into six figures. Carlos is an undocumented immigrant. He works odd jobs to try to make ends meet. So we have the same crime, the same facts, but we have two totally different people. And as a justice system, we need to decide what to do with that. Under the typical approach, we would give them the same sentence. So they'd both get that DUI conviction, that day in jail at least, and hundreds of dollars in fines. But think about what that sentence, what that actually does to these two different people. Jeremy's going to be fine. He's going to pay his lawyer, he'll pay the court costs, he will even pay to spend that day in jail in a nicer jail in the suburbs, because that is a real thing that you can do here in King County. Carlos is going to have it a little tougher. Carlos is going to have trouble paying those fines. He's likely going to be paying the court instead of paying for rent or food or health care. Carlos may face consequences at work or may have a harder time finding work because in his jobs that conviction can be a disqualifier. And Carlos, because he's an undocumented immigrant, might even get deported. So while Jeremy is going back to work at this tech company, Carlos might get deported from the only country that he has ever known. That's justice, when justice is defined as equality. The reasonable question then becomes, what does equity get us? Can equity actually do anything different for us? And the solution there is that equity comes from looking at what we're actually trying to achieve as a system. So in criminal justice, we're trying to get community safety. We're trying to get accountability. And we're trying to make sure that we stay legitimate as a system. So legitimacy comes from being fair to everyone who comes through the court system and comes from upholding society's standards and values. So for Carlos and Jeremy, if we're trying to send that message that they need to take this seriously, that they will literally pay for what they've done because this is something that endangered the community. But Carlos makes $30,000 a year and Jeremy makes $300,000. Don't we need different fines to send that message and get their attention? I said as I started this that I regretted how I handled this case, or at least that I didn't follow my mom's wisdom, which should be one and the same. I didn't go with equity here. I went with equality. And I couldn't stand the idea of Carlos being deported, potentially being deported, while Jeremy went back to work. So I did reduce their charges. No day in jail, lower fines, fewer immigration consequences for Carlos. But I did that for both of them. And because I did that for both of them, I think Jeremy took this less seriously. He took this as a slap on the wrist. So he's more likely to drive drunk again. If I had pursued equity instead of equality, I could have had an outcome that was both more just and more effective. Now, we should acknowledge that this isn't just about taking it easy on people who have had it rough. In fact, equity often means more work. Let's see how many people here can relate to Lamont. Lamont's a 15-year-old I worked with this year. He came across my desk in juvie. How many people here have ever shoplifted? Don't raise your hands. This is on video. I'm a prosecutor. It was too late for you. I'm sorry. So Lamont had shoplifted too. And when a kid in King County shoplifts a couple times, that case will get to my desk. Typically, it's easy. We resolve it pretty quickly, something like 6 months probation, 20 hours community service, something like that. But for Lamont, his problem wasn't really shoplifting. Just like Edwin's problem was really addiction, even though he committed a crime of violence. So for Lamont, he was skipping school more days than not. He was using alcohol and weed daily, even as a 15-year-old. He had mental health issues. And the guys that he got caught shoplifting with had already racked up some serious violent felonies. So for Lamont, how do we get to legitimacy and accountability and community safety? It started by recognizing that we needed to treat Lamont as an individual, not just the embodiment of his crime. By doing that, we put together a plan for mental health counseling. We put together a plan for drug and alcohol treatment, a plan for a mentor that could actually relate to him because this mentor had gone through the same things that Lamont was now going through. So we were asking a lot of Lamont. We were asking way more than someone who has to do 6 months of supervision and 20 hours of community service. And in order to get him to do that, to agree to that higher sentence, I used my leverage as a prosecutor to take that conviction off his record, to say that he would never get that conviction as long as he followed this plan. We used the power of the system, the leverage of the system, to get Lamont services that he really needed. And by doing that, I think we make the community safer. We make Lamont less likely to go down that path of the guys he was with committing serious crimes, including violent crimes. We make it less likely that there will be victims at Lamont's hands in the future. Now, Lamont, Carlos, Jeremy, Edwin, these are all real people, and they're all complicated. We as prosecutors would do well to recognize that, but it's hard. Think back to 2002. Edwin sitting in that car. Do you want Edwin sitting in that car on your street where your kids are playing? Maybe you're the one who goes up to that window, or your loved one is that cop. That discomfort, that uneasiness is why it is always easier to stick to a formula where we have A crime and thus B sentence. But that system of A thus B has led us to a place where in King County now, 50% of the kids who come through juvenile detention end up reoffending. Where nationally, more than 2/3 of prisoners are rearrested within 3 years of release. It's our opportunity as prosecutors to say that this is not enough, that this cannot possibly be good enough. And a colleague of mine hated the idea that this would be something that we have to take on as prosecutors. After all, he said, it's Jeff Sessions that deports them, not us. And he's not wrong, technically. But his point gets us to the uncomfortable reality. The decisions we make have consequences. And those consequences disproportionately fall on those that are already worst off in society. So when we make a decision that it's on its face equal, that has hugely unequal impacts on people's jobs or housing or immigration, even their ability to vote. And we get to decide if what we're doing is enough because we're pursuing equality in our narrow lane, or if we recognize, not just as prosecutors, but in this room as powerful people who have an inordinate amount of influence in our society, whether we want to take on more and recognize that we're not just going to amplify the way things are, we're going to try and change the way things are. So when we're wrestling with this idea of equity and equality, this tension that is there in every decision we make in life, whether to make the intern pay for donuts instead of the CEO, whether to give someone that job or that apartment when they're qualified but have the blemish of a conviction on their record, whether to make Edwin go to treatment or prison. When we're making these decisions, it is so easy to go back to equality. It's so easy to say, it's the same, so it's fair, and feel okay about that decision. But if every time we asked that question, if every time that we tried to justify something like that, we actually checked ourselves and said, maybe not, maybe the same isn't the right answer here. Maybe we need to treat someone differently because of who they are or what we're trying to achieve. If every time we tried to justify something based on that rationale, we all asked ourselves that question and started to pursue equity instead of equality, we really would have the ability to make more change in these systems that we do have the power to affect. Thank you.